In the 1960s, a Stanford professor named Walter Mischel began conducting a series of important psychological studies. During his experiments, Mischel and his team tested hundreds of children, most of them around the ages of 4 and 5 years old. The marshmallow experiment was an experiment that began by bringing each child into a private room, sitting them down in a chair, and placing a marshmallow on the table in front of them. At this point, the researcher then offered a deal to the child. The researcher told them that they were going to leave the room, and if the child did not eat the marshmallow while they were away, they would be rewarded with a second marshmallow. However, if the child decided to eat the first one before the researcher came back, then they would not get a second marshmallow. So the choice was simple: one treat right now or two treats later. The researcher then left the room for 15 minutes. As you can imagine, the footage of the children waiting in the room was rather entertaining. Some kids jumped up and ate the first marshmallow as soon as the researcher closed the door. Others wiggled and bounced and scooted in their chairs as they tried to restrain themselves but eventually gave in to the temptation a few minutes later. And finally, a few of them did manage to wait the entire time. Published in 1972, this popular study became known as the marshmallow experiment. But it wasn't the treat that made it famous. The interesting part came years later. As the years rolled by and the children grew up, the researchers conducted follow-up studies and tracked each child's progress in a number of areas. What they found was surprising. The children who were willing to delay the gratification and waited to receive the second marshmallow ended up having higher SAT scores, lower levels of substance abuse, lower likelihood of obesity, better responses to stress, better social skills as reported by their parents, and generally better scores in a range of other life measures. The researchers followed each child for more than 40 years over and over again. The group who waited patiently for the second marshmallow succeeded in whatever capacity that they were being measured in. In other words, this series of experiments proved that the ability to delay gratification was critical for success in life. If we look around, we can see this playing out everywhere. If we delay the gratification of entertaining ourselves in the immediate, we could end up doing the work that we were supposed to, and the positive effects of it might build up in the longer run. If we delay the gratification of buying desserts and chips at the store, then we might end up eating healthier when we get home. This brings us to an interesting question. Did some children naturally have more self-control and thus were destined for success? Or can you learn or develop this important trait? What determines your ability to delay gratification? Researchers at the University of Rochester decided to replicate the marshmallow experiment, but with an important twist. Before offering the child the marshmallow, the researchers split the children into two groups. The first group was exposed to a series of unreliable experiences where they were promised a small box of crayons later, but they were never brought one. They were told to give up their small stickers with the promise of a bigger sticker, which was never then given. Meanwhile, the second group had very reliable experiences. They were promised better crayons and they got them. They were promised better stickers and they got them. You can imagine the impact these experiences had on the marshmallow test. The children in the unreliable group had no reason to trust the researchers that they would bring a second marshmallow, and thus they did not wait very long to eat the first one. Meanwhile, the children in the second group were training their brains to see delayed gratification as a positive. Every time the researcher made a promise and then delivered on it, the child's brain registered two things: waiting for gratification is worth it, and that I have the capability to wait. As a result, the second group waited an average of 4 times longer than the first group. You can take from this what you may, and there have been several studies that are still trying to question the results of the marshmallow experiment. For example, there was a recent study that seriously calls into question the validity of the delayed gratification as a concept, seeming to suggest that there are other factors in play in the initial experiment that were not accounted for, including affluence. That means how rich or how poor the participant is might greatly affect their actions toward the experiment. It could also be possible that in between the time of these studies and their replications, life outcomes have just become less dependent on the individuals and more on randomness. Could it be that maybe it's just that upward social mobility is harder now than it used to be? So yes, the experiment has been called into question into the recent slew of replication crisis, but it is intriguing nonetheless.